You're listening to the Climate Fair Play podcast. My name is Cody Sanford. I'm a trained ecologist and the host of this podcast. This episode is focused on how the U.S. climate and environmental policy is looking bleak on a national level for the years to come. I said on this podcast how it feels like we are in an infuriating cycle for U.S. environmental policy. Well, we are actually in a spiral to the bottom. Over 70 million people just voted for a man who brags about denying climate change. A man who will gut the EPA and NOAA. For a president and a majority in Congress who will eagerly stop funding United States climate solutions. People who are ignorant of climate change now control not just the U.S. presidency, but the U.S. Congress and the Supreme Court. It feels like a gut punch. This is a blow to every national U.S. environmental policy. I'm not going to hide it. I'm immensely disappointed right now. This was a pivotal point for the U.S. to decide whether the nation would act on climate change, and the United States chose leaders who would rather lie to them about basic science. I'm disappointed because I thought more people understood why climate change and environmental issues were important to their own lives and communities. From the data I can find, Trump grew in popularity in almost every demographic in America. This is clear that people are not connecting what will be lost if we don't act on climate change. But I think what this shows more importantly is people are not understanding what will be gained. I think we all, and by that I mean people who care about climate change, need to do a better job creating that connection in our own worlds, because it will show people that the future we are advocating for is a better one for their families, for themselves, and their communities, right now and in the future. I say that as I'm going to talk about what climate change deniers are going to do now that they have full control over the US government. However, I'm going to end this episode by talking about a project I'm passionate about that I've been working about behind the scenes. I'm really trying to build access points to sustainable solutions in my community of Denver, Colorado. I've made some breakthroughs recently, and I feel like right now is a good time to talk about this. So listen till the end for some positive actions we can focus on. Before we get into the episode, I do want to thank you for listening. It takes a lot of effort to make this podcast possible, and I sincerely appreciate every download the Climate Fair Play podcast gets. Please remember to hit the subscribe button and join in on the discussions on social media. You can find the Climate Fair Play on Instagram, Reddit, and Threads. Now, let's break down how Trump has tried to defund and deregulate the United States environmental policy, and why it largely hasn't worked so far. Starting with what he did as president the first time and is likely to repeat immediately, Trump pulled the United States out of the Paris Agreement and global climate negotiations, and it's guaranteed he will do this again. The United States was a leader in these negotiations. This was one of President Obama's defining international accomplishments. Pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement will jeopardize national security. It shifts the global energy balance away from our strategic interests. It increases our reliance on fossil fuel sources and makes us more vulnerable to international energy market fluctuations, which benefit countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia. The U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement will undermine America's leadership in renewable energy and innovation. This will allow China to dominate the green energy economy. From the research I see, pulling out of the Paris Agreement will almost guarantee that temperatures will rise above the goal of 2 degrees Celsius. The first time Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement, other countries seriously considered withdrawing as well. And I expect we see other major polluting countries reconsidering pulling out of the Paris Agreement with the U.S. out. In 2020, when the US rejoined the agreement, the actual implementation was towards the beginning stages, and we were able to pick up where we left in 2016 at a rather fast pace. But in 2028, the next opportunity for a presidential change, the Paris Agreement will be 12 years old, and the chance to stop the effects of climate change will be even more limited by time. The US pulling out of the Paris Agreement will be a blow to the environment and the future of the Paris Agreement. I don't know where this lack of foresight and preparation for climate change comes from, besides the fossil fuel industry, but the leading force in America, Donald Trump, is spreading extreme falsehoods on climate change. For example, in a recent interview with Elon Musk, he said climate change causes oceans to rise 1/8 of an inch over the next 400 years. When the truth is, every year the oceans are rising more than 1/8 of an inch. These lies are reaching millions and millions of people. This baffling, infuriating denial of climate change will continue in the way Trump's national government functions. Trump stated that his administration would focus on eliminating policies and regulations that he thinks hinders the fossil fuel industry. In Donald Trump's second term, he is expected to try to aggressively target agencies like the EPA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. They're going after agencies that are our front lines for clean air, water, and land. Project 2025 has called on NOAA to be broken up and downsized. People rely on NOAA for weather updates, storm tracking, satellite data, and much more. It's also the agency keeping track of the rise in sea level. The EPA's budget and staffing are also likely going to be gutted. As president, he removed 100 environmental protection laws, mostly centered on air pollution and carbon emissions. When he was president for the first time, he removed climate change from government documents and websites. One major regulation that Republicans have been trying to repeal is the Clean Power Plan. The EPA has passed regulations on coal power plants which will require 90% of carbon pollution to be captured within 8 years, or the plant needs to be shut down. Earlier this year, the industry tried to overturn this ruling, and the courts rejected their efforts, which was a win for everyone. The EPA's projections show that the rule will result in up to $370 billion in net benefits for the climate and public health. Additionally, it is estimated to prevent nearly 1.4 billion metric tons of carbon pollution through 2047. This reduction in carbon pollution is comparable to eliminating the annual emissions of 328 million gasoline-powered cars. But unfortunately, this regulation is likely to be challenged further and overturned with Trump being reelected. Trump is aiming to weaken protections that will not just affect the climate, but air and water quality. Rolling back this threatens to reverse safeguards from pollutants and toxic waste. If these regulations are implemented, experts warn it could impact the EPA's ability to respond to emergencies and get Superfund sites cleaned up. On a positive note, during Trump's first term, nearly 80% of what he tried to do in environmental policy was defeated when challenged in the courts, which is good news. But during his second administration, his team will likely to attempt a different approach. Experts predict that the Trump administration will seek the courts to hold rules in abeyance while they attempt to repeal them. Or the administration might just weaken regulations instead of going through a removal process, which means there would be less of a chance to challenge these changes in the court system. These funding cuts will extend to environmental research and could have long-term consequences for scientific progress and compromise the development in environmental resilience. I remember during the first Trump presidency, my professor told me it was extremely difficult to get funding for any research project that even mentioned climate change. Just the thought of going back to that time is stomach-turning. During the 2024 campaign, Trump focused heavily on how he's going to increase oil and gas drilling. Trump stated that flooding the market with cheap energy is the key to lowering grocery prices, housing costs, utility bills, and inflation, which is not true, and it's not clear what he could really do to push for more oil and gas operations, since these are private companies that fluctuate on demand. I've mentioned before on this podcast how the US is already at peak oil production. Plus, if Trump tries to pump out more oil to reduce prices, OPEC is likely going to stop production to drive prices up. People tend to forget that the oil companies don't want to lose money and don't want their prices to bottom out. Trump has said he'll roll back regulations like allowing drilling on federally owned lands for offshore drilling, but it's not clear that this would actually increase production since, as I said, the US is already at peak oil production. He has pledged to dismantle the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest component of the U.S. environmental strategy that will remove 40% of U.S. emissions by 2030. If they are to accomplish their goal, it will increase pollution, hinder climate change efforts, and negatively impact public health. Luckily, much of the investment to transition is already underway, and it seems like it will be fairly difficult to cut the IRA completely. There are major investments in clean energy, with $450 billion since the IRA was enacted. Companies have invested $320 billion in new car plants, battery manufacturing, and other aspects of electrification. Much of these investments are in Republican-leaning districts, so hopefully Congress will be afraid of the pushback if these manufacturing facilities cut jobs in their districts. Analysts say that while the Trump administration may slow progress, it is unlikely to halt the momentum entirely, as market forces and existing investments continue to drive the adoption of renewable technology. However, Trump has stated he will end incentives for projects like offshore renewable wind farms and other sectors that rely on these tax credits. Electric vehicle credits, solar credits, and other tax incentives from the IRA are likely on the chopping block. On a national level, there will be opposition from environmental groups and legal challenges, but they control Congress and the freaking Supreme Court. Some states are trying to be proactive and curtail Trump's environmental impact. For example, Gavin Newsom in California has called for a special legislative session to Trump-proof the state's climate policies. This includes protecting the 2035 electric vehicle mandate. Democratic-led states like New York and Massachusetts are also preparing legal defenses to protect policies on the environment and reproductive rights. However, Trump already has a plan on how to try and force these states to comply. Trump made a rather vulgar comment, even for himself, at a California rally about forcing Governor Newsom to weaken endangered species protection to increase agriculture water supply. He threatened to withhold federal disaster aid, and that's something he legitimately can do as president. The president has the sole power to approve or deny a governor's request to declare a state of emergency. FEMA recommendations for disaster aid are typically followed by presidents. However, Trump has already deviated from the norm. He delayed aid requested by Governor Newsom and Governor Jay Inslee of Washington. To recap, we can guarantee Trump as president in his second term will pull the United States out of the Paris Agreement. And just to remind listeners, pulling out of the Paris Agreement is a fatal blow to keeping the goal of 2 degrees Celsius alive. Stopping our investment in green energy weakens our national energy dependence and allows China to dominate the green energy economy. His administration is going to target agencies that regulate carbon emissions and control environmental policies. They will withhold funding from individual states who try to Trump-proof their climate policies when they are experiencing fatal natural disasters. Trump is going to try to undo the measures in the Inflation Reduction Act. This includes many tax incentives for regular people, for companies, for society to transition to a carbon-free world. The first time Trump was president, he failed to really halt climate progress. For example, after he pulled out of the Paris Agreement, there was a rally for other nations to step up responsibility. His administration's attempts to change environmental laws and regulations were largely challenged and overturned because he lacked the ability to govern. This time, Trump isn't new to the office and is likely to place people who learn their mistakes after the first time. I think it's important to remember, after his presidency, we've had the largest investment ever in clean energy and adopting to a carbon-free world. These measures are estimated to remove 40% of carbon pollution from the United States by 2030. This is something we have to work to protect. Who controls the U.S. House of Representatives is still being determined, although it will likely stay in Republican control. The outcome of the IRA depends on the shape of the House. They will try to overturn as much as they can, but our voices can get their attention. So when the time comes, we all need to be ready to get a hold of our House representatives, of our senators, and remind them who they're working for. At times like this, when somebody who calls climate change a scam, a hoax, is about to take power of the United States government, it's abundantly clear to me we need momentum for climate progress at a local level. National policies waver, but community-driven solutions are grounded in what's needed for the people who actually live there. Honestly, it's depressing to think about Donald Trump, the climate denier-in-chief, is going back to the White House. He shows no empathy for how intensifying wildfires, hurricanes, and droughts are going to cost the environment severely. He's making lasting decisions for the United States when he has zero skin in the game. He's never going to experience the worst effects of climate change, or any effects of climate change, but billions of people around the world will. And unfortunately, the decisions that are being made ignore the science and urgency of climate change. It's going to put countless lives and ecosystems at risk. Frankly, I need to talk about something else. Something that I'm looking forward to. So from here on out, we will be discussing the project I've been working on to create an access point to sustainable solutions in my community of Denver, Colorado. So stay tuned for this discussion after a quick break. I really think Trump winning needs to be a wake-up call for environmentalists, people who care about climate change, and anyone passionate about creating a sustainable, better future to act. Like, actually do something more than just your current routine. Because what we are doing is obviously not enough if a climate change denier wins so handedly. From my point of view, we are lacking real-world access points for people to connect to climate progress and sustainable solutions. There's few resources connecting environmental solutions with people in a way that actually benefits their lives. I'm urging us to organize and drive progress at the community level. This is something I've been working on alongside this podcast. I'm creating a sustainable market or climate fair. The name's still a work in progress. The goal is to create a space where sustainable resources meet in my community of Denver, Colorado for a regular pop-up market or climate fair. I've secured an indoor facility that can host between 25 and 35 environmental organizations, sustainable businesses, and eco-conscious local vendors for regular pop-up markets. This is the official announcement. I'm sharing this a bit earlier than planned because I feel like it's important to focus on community-driven action right now. And honestly, it's refreshing to share some good news. Currently, I'm in the exploratory phase, reaching out to Colorado's leading voices in sustainability and climate progress. If you know any organizations, creators, or businesses that are pushing for a sustainable future, I'd love to connect with them. More information on the Climate Fair Play pop-up market will be found at climatefairplay.com. I will be sharing the progress I'm making and how I'm putting together this market here on the Climate Fair Play podcast. I want to share this information in case you or anyone listening wants to replicate this kind of event. To be real with you, I've never put together an event like this, but it's been my goal to create digital and real-world access points to environmental progress, and I'm proud to see the vision come to life. I want to thank you again for listening and supporting this podcast. Please hit subscribe or share it with others who care about building a sustainable future. And don't forget to join the conversation on Instagram, Reddit, and Threads.